guys? This X Factor 27 coming back to you guys again today. Today we're gonna be reacting to some of the wildest gimmicks in wrestling. It's a video made by Wrestle with Andy. Like I said, he's one of my favorite YouTube creators. Has a lot of knowledge, so you guys follow him on YouTube, and I'm gonna leave the link in the description below. So let's get ready to react to this.
The wrestling world, being a strange place, has perhaps unsurprisingly been the home of many wild gimmicks over the years.
Right.
But just who were the strangest characters of them all? Well, that's exactly what we are going to be looking at right now, starting with fake Diesel and fake Razor Ramon. Now, when it came to the original Diesel and Razor Ramon, the ones portrayed by Kevin Nash and Scott Hall respectively, they weren't exactly what we'd call wild, especially by the standards of new generation era WWF. No, while a guy who was basically what if Tony Montana from Scarface became a pro wrestler was certainly colorful, it all seemed to make logical sense in the context of the time and place. Where the story took a wild turn for these two gimmicks, however, was in 1996, as that was when, after getting offered a big money contract by Eric Bischoff to go join the competition instead, Hall and Nash decided to jump ship and leave the Fed high and dry, and this left the promotion without two of its top acts. Or at least it did for a short while, because the way Vince McMahon saw it, it wasn't actually Hall and Nash who were the important aspects of these characters. No, it was the IP themselves. And that was exactly why he decided to just recast Diesel and Razor Ramon in September of that year.
Yeah, and that was one of the main complaints people had with Vince McMahon. Vince McMahon always thought the wrestling audience, the wrestling fans were stupid. So they always like to he always liked to downplay our intelligence and stuff. Cause I mean, look at this. You really think we're gonna go notice that's Diesel? That wasn't Diesel and Razor Ramon. I mean, come on. Them guys made the character, and these, like I always say, with Solo Sikoa, these just the T-Move version of these guys, man. So that's crazy.
With the pair now being portrayed by the future Kane, Glenn Jacobs, and journeyman performer Rick Bogner, respectively.
Yeah.
How did this go down with audiences at the time? Well, as you can probably guess, it didn't go down well. No, despite what Vince McMahon may have thought about the characters and fans' connections to them, those same fans were very quick to let WWF know that if Diesel and Razor weren't going to be played by the original two people, then they wanted none of it. After all, Hall and Nash had been so essential to what made the gimmicks work. And that meant whenever fake Diesel and Razor, as they would come to be known, came out through the curtain on an episode of Raw, the crowd proceeded to go mild. But at least the boss was quick to realize things weren't working here. Hell, he probably knew they weren't going to work right from the start, which was why he gave Jim Ross kayfabe blame for being the one to bring the two imposters in. And this all meant that in almost record time, fake Diesel and fake Razor Ramon would find themselves gone from the WWF, with their last on-screen appearances being at the 1997 Royal Rumble. What would the pair do after this? Well, when it came to Rick Bogner, he'd return to being a journeyman wrestler going from place to place, all before sadly passing away in 2019. And when it came to Glenn Jacobs, well, as we mentioned a moment ago, he'd go on to far greater success as the Big Red Machine.
Oh, I did not know that. I did not know that at all. That's knowledge to me. So it ended up working out for Glenn Jacob, aka Kane, either way. Sorry to hear about the other dude. Haiti passed away and stuff, but I'm glad it worked out for Kane though. Ended up working out and he became one of the best wrestlers of all time. So.
And it's just as well he found success at that point, as prior to being fake Diesel, the future mayor of Knoxville County was having to suffer another wild gimmick of the new generation era, that of Dr. Isaac Yankem, DDS. That's right. Well, today the wrestling world has one clear dentist, with that being AEW's former women's world champion, Dr. Britt Baker, DMD. She wasn't the first to choose such a dual career path. No, years before she ever got her start in either field, the first person to step up to the plate as a wrestling dentist was Isaac Yankem. Why did Isaac Yankem decide to lace up his boots and step into the squared circle in the summer of 1995? Well, because this was the point that Jerry the King Lawler was locked into a lengthy and memorable feud with Bret Hitman Hart. And with Yankem being the personal dentist of the King back then, it made all the sense in the world that he'd want to bring the 7-foot monster in to help him fend off his rival once and for all. So it was that at that August SummerSlam, the excellence of execution was asked to prove how good he really was by attempting to get a good match out of such a wild character. Did he succeed in this? No, not really. And that was part of the reason why Dr. Isaac Yankem didn't really do much of note following this. But then, to be fair, it was never.
Man, imagine you're Bret Hart and then you're facing Jerry Lawler and then he bringing this big tall dude that's his dentist, man. That's just crazy. Like you getting jumped by Jerry and his dentist. That's just crazy work for real. And his teeth ain't looking that good either, so that's crazy.
A character which was designed to hang around for the long term. Still, if nothing else, we have to give props to the bad pun of a name that this character had, with it being something which was reportedly coined by none other than Bobby the Brain Heenan.
Oh wow.
And it wasn't like Glenn Jacobs didn't get another chance to succeed after this because, as we've already mentioned, following his run as Fake Diesel, he'd later go on to huge success as Kane, a character he still occasionally portrays to this day.
Right.
Unfortunately, though, not every wild character gets a second or third bite at the apple like that in WWE. No, some have their moment, and when that moment is over, they disappear into the ether forever. And this is exactly what happened with our next subject, the Goon. Don't remember the Goon? We wouldn't blame you if you didn't, because it was a strange gimmick even by the standards of mid-90s wrestling. So it didn't do much of note while it was around then, and it ultimately didn't last very long. That said, it did exist, and boy was it a wild one when it was on TV back in 1996. What was the idea behind the Goon? Well, it was another in the long line of wrestlers with job gimmicks that the New Generation era was oh so famous for. And the job this character, portrayed by Territory star Bill Irwin, had been that of a hockey player. Why was a hockey player moonlighting as a pro wrestler? Well, apparently he'd been kicked out of every hockey league in the world on account of being too violent and getting into too many mid-game fights. So, now needing to make a...
This is the most Vince McMahon gimmick ever, man. Like a hockey player just coming in WWE and just starting to wrestle and just starting beef with wrestlers in WWF is just crazy. That's just how crazy Vince McMahon mind was during the time. What still is probably, but especially during that time, he would try to do anything for it to stick so he can catch fire.
Living elsewhere, he'd taken his fighting skills and applied them to the ring. Not that this would see the Goon get very far in the company though, because even if this was 1996 and we were still very much in the era of WWF trying to figure out where its future lay and how it was going to gain momentum over WCW again, there was no way a character like that was going to reach the main event scene and challenge the likes of Shawn Michaels or The Undertaker for world titles. No, the role of this one was very clearly to remain in the mid-card, all before he eventually disappeared from TV altogether in the spring of 1997. To be honest though, it's probably for the best that the Goon did disappear at this point, as that was when the Attitude Era was starting to percolate. So if he'd been around for that, he would have stood out like a sore thumb, especially as characters such as Stone Cold Steve Austin and Brian Pillman were beginning to bring more of a sense of realism and grittiness to the proceedings in the WWF.
Exactly.
But then there were a lot of relics from bygone eras who needed to go when the Attitude Era took hold, as the New Generation era had certainly given us a lot of wild gimmicks. And another example of that can be found in our next subject, the one, the only, TL Hopper. What was the gimmick TL Hopper had? Well, unlike the Goon, who was a wrestling hockey player, Hopper was a wrestling plumber. That's right, apparently...
Bro, so we just having career day pretty much in WWE right now. So we went from a dentist to a hockey player to a plumber now. So Vince McMahon was just throwing anything at the ground pretty much. I bet when he went to Shane's career day and he saw some of the parents come in and tell him what they did for a living, he probably like, I can make a gimmick out of that. You know how Vince McMahon talking.
The plumbing industry was going through some hard times back in 1996 because business was so low for Tony Anthony back then, he had no choice but to hit the ring too in order to make a few extra bucks. But even if this one was pretty out there even by the standards of the mid-90s, TL Hopper did manage to hang around for a few months and make enough of an impact that he's still being talked about today. Sure, the impact he made might have been less, that was cool, and more, what the heck was that? But an impact is an impact nonetheless. Yes, it was silly, but so were a lot of things back then. And Tony Anthony, the man behind the gimmick, played the whole thing with gusto every time he was on screen, giving it some sense of camp value, if nothing else. Could TL Hopper have done more if he'd hung around a little longer and been part of the Attitude Era? Probably not. In fact, like with the Goon, it's probably for the best that he wasn't around for this, as he would have really stood out in a bad way. That said, some of those weird gimmicks from the new generation did occasionally make cameos during the times which followed, and when they did, they would always at least get a nostalgic pop from fans, with one of the most notable examples of this coming from our next subject, Doink the Clown. Now, Doink the
Shout out to my ex, by the way. That's how she looked. So yeah.
Clown might be a wild gimmick like a lot of the other wrestlers with jobs who populated mid-90s WWF, as he was a wrestling clown, and an evil one at that, someone who had more in common with Pennywise from It than he did with Ronald McDonald. But what separates him from others like TL Hopper and the Goon is that he was legitimately scary for many young fans, or at least he was in his original incarnation. And that's because the original incarnation of Doink was played by none other than Matt Osborne, a man who threw himself into this role at 1,000 miles an hour. So that meant when Doink first appeared on WWF TV back in the late 1992, he wouldn't feel like yet another campy gimmick of the era. No, there was something altogether sinister and genuinely upsetting about the way he did things.
Yeah, I bet a lot of young kids were probably scared of clowns, especially watching WWF down during the time, and then you have an evil clown doing crazy crap like this. That's crazy, man. So I remember doing the clown. I wasn't alive when he was wrestling, but I remember getting into wrestling and seeing him when I was a little bit younger. I think I was like 10 or 12 years old. When I was watching WWE on 24/7. I bet a lot of you young guys don't know about that. It was on demand, but I remember seeing him. He gave me a couple nightmares. I think I was more scared of him than I was Pennywise. So both of them look like my ex. So shout out to them.
And that was exactly why he was able to strike such fear into the hearts of young fans who were watching all around the world. Of course, as time went on and Matt Osborne found himself getting fired, the Doink character would find itself changing as new people donned the face paint, with performers like Steve Kern and Steve Lombardi taking the whole thing in a far more family-friendly direction. That's right, once the original was no longer in the driver's seat anymore, the clown would be far less the Joker from Batman, and a whole lot more of a lovable goofball who loved nothing more than to playfully tease heels on the roster by doing things like throwing buckets of water over them. Was this as good as the OG Psycho Doink? Not quite, but it allowed the gimmick to live on for a lot longer than it might have otherwise. Hell, even to this day, you can probably find someone donning the clown makeup at your local indie show. And even in WWE, Doink the Clown has been an occasional presence on TV with his many cameo appearances over the years, cameo appearances which saw him be played by industry legends like Jeff Jarrett and Chris Jericho.
Oh, wow. I did not know that. So even some of the best of all time have become Doink a little bit. So I guess it's just contagious. So shout out to them for knowing that, man. But yeah, I think that was the best bet for them to make it more family friendly, excuse me, for them, because the evil sinister clown probably gimmick was really good, but probably for that era, especially with more young kids coming into wrestling, they probably saw like, okay, we don't need to scare kids away, and that we could lose our revenue and stuff like that. So you're like, we're gonna get the clown to be happy and be a regular jokester. So still cause nightmares. So
let's move away from people who first rose to prominence during the New Generation era for a moment, and instead over to someone who first appeared during the Ruthless Aggression era. Someone who originally had big things planned for him. Who are we talking about here? Why, Mordecai, of course. Now, Mordecai is another gimmick which fans may have forgotten about because, in truth, it wasn't around for that long. No, his later gimmick of Kevin Thorne on the WWE CW brand hung around for a lengthier period. But while that gimmick was certainly wild, it had nothing on what he was doing back in 2004. And that's because 2004 was the first time he was introduced to fans with a character unlike anything which had really been seen by them before, with this being a religious zealot who'd come into WWE in order to cleanse it of all its evils. Needless to say then, this character, who went by the name of Mordecai, instantly became a heel in fans' eyes. But then that was exactly the way the company wanted you to feel about him, as they had big plans for him going forward. Plans which were eventually supposed to culminate in him challenging The Undertaker at WrestleMania. Yes, a spiritual, spooky character decked out in all white who feels like he's the hero but is actually the villain. It's pretty much the exact inverse of the dark hero who the Dead Man had been playing for much of his career up until that point. Sadly though, this planned showdown between the pair never ended up coming to pass, with the reason for that being that Mordecai never really clicked in the ring during his early appearances. And that led to WWE management deciding to pull the plug on the whole angle before it could get to the point that The Undertaker got involved in the proceedings. Yes.
Dang. Okay. So pretty much we just had an evil villain pretty much from like you guys play video games and stuff. Kind of remind me like one of the Outlast characters from I think it was Outlast 2. Yeah, I think Outlast 2 is like really religious, scary type character. That's what he reminds me of, and Joseph C from the Far Cry series as well. So I can kind of see why they kind of then let him fight the Undertaker, because that match would have been a big dud at WrestleMania, for real.
Even by the standards of some of the wild gimmicks we've already looked at today, Mordecai's run in the WWE was particularly short-lived, with it ending in July of 2004, only 3 months after it first debuted. And as we mentioned, Mordecai would later get another chance to do his thing in WWE under an all-new gimmick when he joined the WWE CW brand in 2006 as Kevin Thorne. What about the once chief rival to WWF, WCW? Surely they had their own fair share of wild gimmicks over the years too, right? Well, yes they did, and one of them happens to be our next subject as it happens, the Maestro. Who was the Maestro? Well, back in 1999, a young journeyman wrestler named Robert Kellum, who'd previously worked for places like Smoky Mountain Wrestling and the USWA, got himself a job with World Championship Wrestling. Unfortunately for him, though, Kellum would not be portraying himself when he debuted in WCW soon thereafter. No, he'd instead be given one of the wildest gimmicks of that era, that of a music conductor who looked like he'd been modeled specifically on Ludwig van Beethoven. And this meant not only having the
Bruh came from orchestra practice straight to be into WCW, man, to wrestle. Lord, we pretty much have a career day, pretty much in this video, pretty much.
the aptitude for music that Beethoven had, but also the crazy dress sense and big bouffant hair. Of course, that alone isn't what makes this gimmick so wild, though. After all, by the standards of what WWF had been putting out there a few years previously, a wrestling musician wasn't a big stretch of credibility when compared to wrestling garbage men and hockey players. No, what really tipped Maestro over the edge was the fact that he was never supposed to be a conductor in the first place and only had to be changed into this at the last minute. So if he wasn't supposed to be this character, who was the Maestro originally supposed to be? Well, that would be Gorgeous George. More specifically, Gorgeous George III, the third incarnation of the character so famously created by George Wagner back during the 40s. What WCW didn't realize at the time, however, when they put plans in motion for this, was that they didn't own the rights to the gimmick. Rather, Randy Savage owned them, and he already had plans to use the name for his new female valet. Obviously, then, this meant Robert Kellum's dreams of being in the big leagues were about to fall through should WCW not be able to repackage him quickly. And that's exactly what they did, using the dress sense he'd developed and the haircut he'd grown out and repurposing it as this new Beethoven-inspired character. And this was exactly why it was so short-lived, with it ultimately being gone from TV by the time 2000 came around. But what about another wild character? One who famously presented himself to fans as a tax officer working for the Internal Revenue Service. Well, that would be our next subject, Irwin R. Shyster.
Yeah, I remember IRS, man. I wasn't around during that time, but I remember that gimmick for real.
Yes,
IRS.
long before Bray Wyatt or Bo Dallas ever came around, the Rotunda family was most well known in the wrestling world for the fact that it gave us Mike Rotunda, the tag team star throughout the 1980s who appeared in notable duos like the Varsity Club and the US Express. Come 1991, however, right as the golden era of WWF was reaching its dying days, he'd find himself moving away from playing the varsity athlete he had before and turning into something entirely different. What was this new path Mike Rotunda was about to follow? Well, that would be of an evil taxman who went by the name of Irwin R. Shyster, or IRS for short.
Imagine you not paying your taxes and the IRS tax man comes up on site and y'all have to wrestle. If you don't beat him, you gotta go to jail pretty much. So it's on site with the IRS man, I guess. So good thing they don't do that in real life. So.
And even though Rotunda played this role to perfection, making the character all too easy to hate it, it doesn't change the fact that it was a weird one, as why was this tax officer now working as a wrestler in kayfabe? Really, if you thought about it too hard, it didn't make that much sense.
Dang.
Perhaps the weirdest thing of all when it comes to IRS, however, is the fact it lasted so long. Yes, while most of the Wild wrestlers with jobs gimmicks of the time period ended pretty quickly, as there wasn't really much you could do with them beyond that initial run, when it came to Erwin R. Shyster, he actually managed to hang around all the way up until 1995. And even
Oh,
at that point, when he returned to WCW, he'd basically be playing the same character, albeit under a different name of VK Wall Street. Hell, even during the mid-2000s, Mike Rotunda would be there, back under the IRS guise, as he took part in the occasional on-screen cameo while working as a backstage producer. And in the years since then, he's continued to pop up for the occasional cameo appearance from time to time. And this has to make him one of the most successful Wild gimmicks of all time then, because again, we're not getting that many returns from the likes of the Goon anymore, and
nope.
we're not seeing a Hall of Fame induction for TL Hopper on the horizon anytime soon. But IRS wasn't the only person involved in the financial industry who famously healed it up on fans during the early 90s. No, the exact same thing could be said about our next Wild gimmick, the Repo Man.
First of the year, people always get cars first of the year. So, and when they get their taxes and they never pay their cars off. So, imagine you one of the people that don't pay for your car note, and then you got to fight the repo man. If he beats you, you get your car repossessed. So, yeah, it's on site still.
Of course, in the Repo Man's case, he wasn't technically a banker or a taxman or anything like that, but he did work on their behalf because his job was to repossess the goods of people who couldn't pay for them. And this understandably made him a heel in the eyes of fans then. But it wasn't just fans who hated the Repo Man. No, his fellow wrestlers also had no love for this creation of Barry Darsow either when it debuted in 1991. And few were more upset with him than Macho Man Randy Savage, as it was during a feud between the pair that the heel repossessed Randy Savage's hat in one of the weirdest angles of the era. Yes, this storyline only helped to make fans hate the Repo Man. And that was quite an achievement considering the fact that not long before this, Barry Darsow had been beloved by audiences, as it was at this point he was playing his prior character, Smash from Demolition.
Oh,
Obviously, though, Smash did a lot more to endear himself to fans, at least when Demolition were playing the role of babyfaces. With Repo Man, though, there was no such attempts to get over as a hero made by him. And so, throughout the early 90s of WWF, he continued to terrorize babyfaces by taking what was theirs and making it his. But let's move away from the 90s and onto something more modern, as our next Wild character came decades later in NXT, that being Mei Ying. Now, if you're a current day NXT fan, then you might be more familiar with Mei Ying as Wendy Chu, the developmental brand's resident sleepy girl who has both good and evil versions. But before she was doing this, Karen Q was working under a different gimmick, with this one being far spookier in
hey, she's still a baddie. So, and all that panic and scaredness, she's still a baddie. So,
its nature. And the reason it was spookier was because it was that of Mei Ying, a mystical, centuries-old figure who seemed to have some power over her underlings, Boa and Xia Li. How would this power present itself? Well, through Ying occasionally hitting the ring and destroying her opponent, all while she was wearing black and white kabuki makeup, which made her look like Samara from The Ring if she were the daughter of the great Muta. In fact, Mei Ying even used the same mist that Muta made so famous back in the day. But unfortunately, that would not be enough to see the gimmick have any long-term success. Yes, it was then that after failing to get over in any notable kind of way, the gimmick of Mei Ying, as well as the extended universe around her, would stop before it could really get going. Thankfully, though, this
yeah, kind of how they it's kind of not like how they got it going now, but how they kind of repackaged Shinsuke Nakamura, not with like the mystical part, but just kind of like that dark aura present stuff. Kind of reminds me of the new this new version of Shinsuke Nakamura, pretty much. Yeah.
wouldn't be the end of Karen Q in WWE. No, as we mentioned a moment ago, she would rise again as Wendy Chu, with this being a gimmick which was much less spooky and much more comedic in its nature. Still though, even if she has had some success with that character, it's a shame she couldn't have gotten longer to see where she could have taken Mei Ying.
All right, guys, but that was the end of the video. Really interesting gimmicks. I tell you, man, it was very interesting. So pretty much we just had career day, pretty much, and a mythical person pretty much in this video. So which one of the gimmicks were you guys' favorite and least favorite in this video? Just